Education innovation transcends geography. And all across the country, amazing work is happening. And I'm so thrilled that we're going to get a chance to visit with these state leaders and talk about the ways in which they are transforming the high school experience. Before we do that, though, and dive in, I do want to call out a few other folks in the room. We have Kirsten Basler, who's the state chief in North Dakota. Oh. We have Secretary Nellie Sanders from Oklahoma. And we're going to be joined, Tony Thurman from California is joining us. And I'm telling you that both because they're leading important work and we want to acknowledge them, but also because tomorrow there is a session with all of these state chiefs. And so I know you're going to be really, your appetite is just going to be whetted with this conversation. And I want you to know that you're going to have a chance to hear from all of those folks tomorrow in a breakout session. So we're going to just dive in. And as I said, this work transcends geography. And it's happening in states with very different contexts. And that's one of the many reasons why I'm so excited to hear from this group. So you all are leading work, and in that work, you are moving away from seat time and our traditional ways of managing school, and we heard a little bit about that from President Knowles, and you're making it happen. And we would love for each of you to describe that work for us and some of what you think is most important about the work that you're leading.
All right, well,
perhaps Dr. Dickson.
Sure. Good morning. I am a big believer that we have been driven by what I call the 3 Bs, bells, buses, and butt time for far too long. Crass way to say it, but those 3 Bs have really confined a lot of school systems. And so we've been thinking in our state for about 7 years about personalized competency-based learning and had the ability to work with legislators and a number of stakeholders to give out grants. So we've had these 3-year grants that include planning, which is super important, before we get to implementation. And that seemed to be a catalyst to really spark a different way of being, really thinking about performance, and not in the way we might always think about performance, but how can our students show what they know in very different ways. So we've been as a system really trying to elevate that work, and so excited that you got to hear from Tim and we are just really thrilled about the national movement, because we've been interested in quite some time, and we have pockets of promise all over our state, thinking about how to scale that up and working on this scale up so that every student has the opportunity is what we're really excited about. Attached to that, our most recent work is around a first credential, making sure that every student who leaves our system has a first credential, either an industry or an associate's degree, something that resonates with the very things we've been talking about this morning.
Thank you, Dr. Dickson.
Yeah, well, good morning, and let me just say it's an honor to be here. I appreciate the XQ Institute and the Carnegie Foundation for affording this. The energy in this room is just fantastic.
Palatable.
It's absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for your presence here. Thank you very much. I'm going to be asking a lot of you later in this panel discussion, but so our journey really has, well, my personal journey is I spent 10 years as a high school principal, which is what you end up looking like after 10 years as a high school principal, many, many years ago, and then later as a district superintendent, and now where I'm at with the Department of Education and Workforce. I would say this, that Ohio has enshrined in the Ohio Revised Code the opportunity for every district to do competency-based education. We even did it 14 years ago in Reynoldsburg City Schools, where I was superintendent, where we did mastery learning at the time as a form of making sure kids actually knew what they needed to know. So we have a thing called Credit Flex in our state that's in the Ohio Revised Code that gives permission to any district to do competency-based education. We have also simultaneous credit. So if you want to integrate coursework and subjects together, you get one or two credits, depending on how you do that. And then we have an innovation waiver opportunity to have relief from rule, or in some cases, laws in our state to rethink the education of young people. And so we're positioned really well in Ohio to do these things. And let me just say from the outset that for me, this is not about high school redesign, high school restructure, high school reform, any other RE word I can think of. This is about making sure that every child has a chance at economic mobility and prosperity for their families. That's what this is really about to me. And so we have to organize ourselves, the adults in the system, around the needs of kids. In fact, I will tell you that the Department of Education and Workforce has made students and families our primary customer. School districts and providers, educational providers, are a secondary customer. We need them to function well and provide the things they need, but the center and the focus is going to be on the student needs and their families.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I am going to say an R word.
Whoa!
I know, like to be controversial, but we are reimagining high school in Rhode Island, or I would say we already have, and we're in the process of doing that. One of the things that we feel very strongly about was really all students having that opportunity, and what we were doing just wasn't working. It just was not. And we had failed our students, and when we took a really hard look at what we were doing, we had to step back and say, what are we going to change? And we couldn't just do it from district by district. It had to be a statewide initiative, because we couldn't leave it up to, well, if you went to that school, this is what your outcome was, this is what your trajectory was going to be. It was really important for us to move the needle for all the students in our state. So there came the rebirth and the reimagining of what our high schools would look like. And I'll tell you a little bit later how that was born, because I say this all the time and people might think I'm a fan or a groupie, but I am of XQ. Because of XQ, we actually made that move. And we had to make a decision during the pandemic. Are we gonna take this on right at the beginning of the pandemic? And we said we had to. We didn't have a choice. And for us, it was setting the standard and setting the stage of what a Rhode Island diploma means. And are we looking at competency? Are we continuing to keep the, here's another R word, the rigor? Are we continuing to move the agenda for our students? Are they ready for work? Are they ready to actually participate in higher ed? Are the doors open? And all of those were no, no, and no. So we decided to make that move where we started looking at civics. Somebody said earlier today, civics important? Yes, it is. More now than ever. So we made that a requirement. And yes, another R word, requirement. Yes, because it was important. So it was arts, it was civics, computer science, all the things that our students said to us. So we brought in our students that left us and said, where did we fail you? What would you have liked to have known that we did not give you? And we went through all of those categories. Financial literacy, all the things that were important to them that they feel they were struggling with as they moved on. And as we did this work, it became more apparent that there was a lot more work to do. And with our work with XQ, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, but the Educational Opportunity Audit, if you haven't done it, you need to do it.
I was hoping you were going to mention that one, actually, because it's an amazing tool. Yes. So these leaders you've described really important work. And I know that the students and school leaders and district leaders here and those watching appreciate that, because you're setting the conditions that allow them to do work that they know needs to be done. I would love if you all could describe for us more about the how of the implementation, including lessons that you've learned, for the folks who are in here or watching who are thinking about what you would do differently perhaps, but the way that you went about it. How did you make these really significant changes come about in your states? Angélica, why don't we switch things up and start with you?
Sure. So in 2019, we did the Education Opportunity Audit. And I will tell you, we had teachers crying, we had principals crying, superintendents, 64 high schools participated, and we were sitting there. And the reason that they were crying is that our kids said, 8 out of 10 kids said they wanted to go to a 2-year or 4-year college, but their transcript demonstrated that they weren't even taking the courses to prepare them for that. So when we went through the data, that audit, we said, okay, we need to change. And what we did was we presented it to my council. And anytime you promulgate regs, it is very controversial. Nobody wants the state telling you what to do. So what we did is that we did this in partnership with those teachers, with the students. The students were angry. they were really angry. They said, what is going on here? We need change. And we presented and we said, we have to do this. And what we did is that we did it with the students, with the teachers. We engaged everyone that we could think of. It was almost a 2-year process. We got the most feedback on these regs, and everybody felt a part of the conversation. There's a line that we had that we owe to Steve. You know, we didn't want to be right, we wanted to get it right. And that meant that all the voices, even the opposition, right when we were ready to go, we had some people that still were hesitant. And we said, okay, so let's go to the table. What do you want? How do we tweak the language? But at the end of the day, we have to change what we have. And that's what we did. And everybody sat at that table, and everybody was very nervous because while this was happening, there was a transitioning governor in my state. And when that happens, the new administration gets very nervous about big changes happening. And I remember sitting with him and saying, we've got to do it. You know, we just have to do it. You have to trust me. And we did, and we moved it. And I have to tell you that we had so many people saying this is a must. So now our class of 2028 has these new requirements that are really important. What they said to us, you know, we've been talking for a very long time about not meeting the needs of all kids.
Yeah, very long
And
time.
we've been going in circles, and we heard this morning that we're having the same conversation. But at the end of the day, we surveyed our students, and our students, 36% of them said that they are caregivers. If we make kids choose between school and taking care of their siblings we're not gonna win. So how do we rearrange things where seat time is not a barrier, where it's about understanding what they bring, and how do we capture that without diminishing the rigor, again, another R word, which I will change my vocabulary by the end of this session.
Frank has all of us up in our heads about the words which is good, which is really,
Well, I want to
really
be
good.
clear, mine is RE, not necessarily R. I'm all about rigor, relevance, and relationships, that kind of a thing. But
Yeah.
just building on a couple of things, I think, first of all, we can't underestimate the power of leaders. In my state, I'm blessed to have a governor who led on the science of reading, for example, one of the first states out of the block on adopting science of reading. We are a home rule state, which means we have 611 school districts who are governed by locally elected Board of Education members. We have 728 chartered non-public, which includes charter schools and others. Then we have 346 independent schools which receive no tax dollars. So we have a plethora of governance structures in our state, all with the authority to adopt their own curriculum the way they want to do it. We have state standards and model curriculum, but they don't have to use either in that respect. So the leadership of the governor was incredibly important because for the first time in Ohio history, we actually mandated the science of reading to all schools. You do not have a choice now. It's law in the state of Ohio. We also banned 3Qing in that same legislation. So we had a governor who led. We had General Assembly leadership in both the Senate President and the Speaker that got us to where we are. And by the way, I'm finishing my first year as a director. I did serve 4 years in the State Board of Education prior to that. So there's a couple things I think that's important to that. Not only did we have the legislative leadership and the governor aligned, which sometimes doesn't happen, imagine that, but we did. Also the leadership of various associations, the teachers associations, the administrator associations, and so forth, all came together around policy. Everything from the science of reading to our cell phone policy that we just enacted in the state. And now we're coalescing around all things workforce readiness. And so and again, sometimes I think we just kind of underestimate the power of leadership and the bully pulpit that leaders have. And so I think that's certainly a place that we've done. Now, a couple other policies that we've implemented over the last several years, College Credit Plus, for example, that's a dual credit. Any student in Ohio qualifies to take a college course, is eligible to take a college course beginning in middle school, tuition free, textbook fees free. And that's been a godsend to a whole lot of kids. Now, the challenge with it is that we have found that a lot of kids, particularly those who are clearly university bound, are using it to take their gen eds and reduce the cost of a degree, which is great for parents, right? And ultimately probably good for kids. But it's not reaching the students that we initially wanted to reach, and that is that marginalized student in high school that doesn't necessarily qualify exactly because they don't pass a placement test or they don't have a certain GPA or things like that. So we're working hard to amend the rules and regulations following College Credit Plus to ensure that we're reaching. Originally, it was supposed to be a pathway. You were going to take courses that led to a degree or led to a set of stackable certificates. And they got, over the years, it kind of got away from that original intent. But again, I'm just going to talk about leadership in that way because I think it matters, and it matters big time.
I'm really struck by the pillars in this building and so many buildings in our great nation's capital, and they're beautiful. Thinking about the strength of these pillars, and one of the pillars of our strategic plan, we have 4, and one has been personalized competency-based learning. And I was thinking about the genesis of that in preparation for this conversation, and it really happened in about 2017. I was sitting in a room on our own Capitol Hill with policymakers, people who were really interested in ed tech. There were education partners, variety of people. We were missing students. I always forget to, how often we leave out students in these important conversations. But we were talking about the future of technology. I don't know if you've heard of Silicon Slopes. We have our own silicon, and it's slopes in Utah where we ski. But we have a lot of ed tech startups in our state, and people were really interested in bringing these, what it felt like at the time, bright, shiny tools to help assist our students. So we said, we've got to have a framework in mind. Let's put something together. And we put together a huge initiative with funding behind it and legislation that was comprised of certainly compromised people, but also was comprised of timelines and funding and expectations, and again, the planning. And this is where we learned having a 3-year grant that included planning as the focus before you implement was so important. So that was all put in place, and one of the key elements was not just the hardware, the wiring of it all, for sure. So devices, making sure kids were connected, but most importantly, teachers knowing how to use the tools. Fast forward to this thing called the pandemic, and we closed down schools on a Friday, and on a Tuesday, 70% of our students had devices in their homes and were connected, and teachers were ready to teach on a Tuesday. Now, nobody was prepared, but it taught us a great lesson that when you plan well and implement well, you are prepared for the future. And that, for me, was the foundation of how we now fast forward to thinking about the barriers that are in place. Just this morning, another pillar that I was discussing with my friend Mackie Raymond from Hoover Institute, I just think we have the knowledge we need. We have an implementation gap. We have a knowing doing gap in this country when it comes to education. So I was talking with Mackie about, we have these pockets of promise, and I'm confounded a bit that we can't scale it all up, because we've got amazing schools doing work in the competency world, and we're all behind it. Like, we've got our arm around them and a hand in the back. Let's go, let's move. We've removed requirements and we have waivers. So I said to Mackie, we have these waivers and people aren't taking advantage. And I thought what you said, Mackie, was so brilliant about, it's that first 50 feet. People don't always launch into the unknown because they don't know how to get from where they are and take those first 50 steps or get 50 feet down the road. They need some really concrete guidance. So even today, Deb, I am learning from colleagues about how do we scale this up? Because if you come to my state, I can take you to great schools where this is happening. Charters, big districts, tech schools. I can show you our policy where, competency can happen everywhere. But why isn't it? And I really appreciated that insight, that those first 50 feet, we perhaps can lean in a little bit more instead of pushing hard, lean in a little bit more and help them with guidance. So that's my takeaway from today.
Can I just add to that?
I would love that.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think, Frank Luntz said it really well. What's the consequences of inaction? And in our state, same as what you just described, we have these, I call them random acts of improvement in our state. Districts are doing really good things. Kids are engaged, kids are motivated, they're graduating with skills, et cetera, but we don't have scale. And the challenge, and you used the phrase implementation gap, clearly there's an implementation gap, but there's also a will gap. There's a political will gap, not only sometimes at the state level, but even at the local level. because change is hard and it's difficult for communities sometimes. The high school institution is a resilient institution. Think about the organization of a high school. It hasn't changed fundamentally in 50 years. And we still have 7-period days. I mean, how much sense does that make? Because it's driven by the Carnegie unit. And so there's a number of things there that we have to coalesce around. So what problem are we trying to solve? You know, the high school diploma is not a proxy for skills. It may be a proxy for certificate of attendance or certificate of participation maybe, but it's not a proxy for skills. And yet we know more and more employers are moving to skill-based hiring. And so that's why a competency-based, skill-based approach to being able to demonstrate what kids know and they're able to do is a really, really important piece. I think the other piece for me is our governor has put together we're going to model the behavior we want schools to do. So we've put together a 7-agency group led by McKinsey. McKinsey is facilitating the process for us. They've given us great data on the problem that we're trying to solve. And so these other agencies are all coming together to build out a workforce plan for the state. And it's a framework. It's not, you know, you're going to do X, Y, and Z. It's a framework for what we need done. And that's the model. So when you ask what's next, that's one of them for me, is I really believe this is a partnership first approach. You know, none of us can do this by ourselves. That's why every one of you sitting here are really important to this conversation, because we all have to figure out how we lock arms and do this single-minded thing to make sure kids graduate from high school with the things, the skills that they need to have to either be employed or enlist or enrolled. A lot of our districts use the 3 E's as a place-based goal for all kids graduating. So that's what I'm going to ask of this group, is lean in with us, help us figure it out, and create the will for this to happen for all kids. But when I was local superintendent, I used to use the phrase all means all. My board, every board meeting would say, okay, Steve's going to say all means all. Well, you're damn right Steve's going to say all means all, because it's not about some. It's about all kids, and we have to figure this out for all.
Can I challenge a little bit, though?
Let's challenge. Just go after it.
The idea of willingness. I think I see this with teachers sometimes, whether it's a leader, a teacher, sometimes we say they're just not willing. I think we mislabel willingness when it's often a capacity issue.
Could be, yeah.
I think sometimes they just don't know what they don't know. They need to see it. They need to feel it. It needs to be visceral. They need to participate. And I hear that often in our arena of people aren't willing. And I heard that just yesterday from my own local superintendent. So I hear you. And I probably said they're not
willing. This is
willing,
a big debate in our agency.
But I do
right
think that we have a capacity issue that we have not put a lot of money and time into skilling up and providing quality professional learning opportunities.
We could have a really good conversation about that.
Yeah, I'm going to push just a little bit. So I think
Keep pushing.
Some pushing here.
I love it.
I'm in the middle. I love it. It's like,
the reality is that we all want the same things, regardless of what state, red, blue, purple, it doesn't really matter. We want our kids to succeed. And when we talk about, you know, whether it's a willingness, whether it's a capacity issue, it's all those things, right? But it's also the other R, responsibility, right? What is the responsibility of the state? And
you're really focused on your R's, aren't you?
I love my R's. But at the end of the day, what is my job, right? Like, where do I see myself? Like most of the other states, we have local control, local responsibility, but my job is to set policy, right? To work with my board to set policy that sets the stage for that, and to do that with them. Once we did, and again, nobody is paying me, but once we did the education opportunity audit, people cried. Like, they understood that this could not continue. And when we had these kids come in and say, you failed us, everybody sat around a table and said, okay, what do we do? And what we're doing now, we have this competency-based diploma. But how do we take that apart? And we're doing it with them. We're not asking them to do it on their own, take this whole thing apart. We're learning together. The student voice is there, the teacher voice, even the political voices at the table, right? What do we want that to look like? We have kids that come into our system that already dominate another language, and we're making them sit and take another language. Why are we doing that? What are we doing? We have kids that are responsible for their grandparents, their siblings. They have some of those durable skills that we haven't figured out exactly how to measure it. So that's what we're doing. We're putting those things to work. We're having, they don't have to sit there. It doesn't have to look the same. And we're taking that apart with the community. Nobody wants things done to them, but we all have to decide that it is our responsibility to do it. I have to tell you that, how many of those kids say, well, that's an easy A class? Then why are you taking it? Like, what are we doing? And I'm responsible. I have a 14-year-old that decided to take Chinese instead of Spanish, and I was like, why? But that's great, right? But why would she be in a Spanish class? She can ace it. What are we doing? Like, we have created these walls and barriers, and it's very scary, right? That's why the responsibility is really important, because if you've been in education long enough, we know that this pendulum swings in all different directions. And we don't want to be there. We want to really understand. Parents have been telling us for a while, this is not what we want. And we just kept moving forward. And we're in this place where we have to have this difficult conversation, but grounded on something that's solid, on research, on what we know works.
There is so much you all have said, and I think there's a fascinating intersection between the policy work and the implementation work. And having, I was a state chief, as you know, for about 10 years, and more recently was a district superintendent. And so the intersection there of, like, you put policies in place, but then you have the need for that quality implementation, and there's so many complications because of, as you all have said, it's like the way we do school now, and there are all these systems that support that. It's going to take all of us. One of y'all said this, and I was thinking about when Dr. Lomax said the importance of partnership. And so we have, all across this room, we have storytellers and students and educators and researchers and funders. And I would love for us to wrap up with you all talking about what is it that you need specifically from folks in this room, from the folks in your states, in order to make sure that not only the policies get changed, but also that the systems and the structures continue to be adjusted so that we can have quality implementation.
That's a heavy question, but I was thinking about the work of our Portrait of a Graduate, and most states have been doing this. We're a Portrait of a Learner, whatever you call them. Ours is Portrait of a Graduate. The process and the development of that portrait was more important than the outcome. Mm-hmm. Students, teachers, parents, everybody coming together for us to create a state model. And during the summer of 2020, so pandemic year, teachers feeling the need to connect, and they took all of our standards and played out all the competencies for every content, every grade level. So we have this really rich portrait, which is lovely, but it's the process of bringing people together to do the work. What we need from everybody in this room is contribution, sincere, authentic contribution to those conversations. Not just a nod of the head and a pat on the back, but challenge us, contribute to it, lean in, lean way in, and say, I have an idea, I have a contribution. And that takes all of us. I love what you said about responsibility, Angélica. I think it's our collective efficacy and our collective responsibility to do so.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would echo any process that engages people at the local level around the problem that they're trying to solve. And I think that part of that, whether it's Portrait of the Graduate or any other kind of process, gets us there. I guess where we're looking in Ohio is that the governor put a stake in the ground around, in a State of the State speech, around making sure every kid's on a pathway to something. It sounds like a very ambiguous kind of goal, but that doesn't happen in our schools largely, that they're actually on a pathway to something that matters to them. And the second piece is that he thinks every kid ought to have a plan. We call it a career plan in his talking points, but it's bigger than that. It's really having a trusted adult mentoring kids through a process that they discover themselves. We need to grab kids' hearts and their minds as they go through the system, starting as early as middle school, with just so many of our kids. We've got a super pilot we're doing right now with 10,000 kids who graduated from high school but never entered college, because that's a lost group of kids in our state. And nobody pays attention to them unless they're in the benefits system. Nobody's paying attention to them. They're not enrolled in college. And we're learning a lot from these kids about their experience while they were in K-12 and then their experiences after K-12. And that's going to inform a lot of policy around how we deal with these youngsters moving forward. And so stay tuned on that.
Thank you.
We're trying to get people to pay attention to this phenomena in our country.
Right.
Because it is a phenomenon. It's a large group of kids,
Yeah, you're right.
year over year. So we don't want every kid to have a plan that minimally has an academic, career, and financial planning focus, because there should be conversations with kids and families about ROIs as they think about college major, or they think about employment or enlistment. They all have some information as they go through the system, and a set of experiences, work-based learning, whatever you want to call it, so they can make informed decisions. They may very well change those decisions, and they should in many cases. So that's kind of where we're heading, but I want to mention one other thing, and that's the power of regional partnerships. So when I was at community college, I'd spent 8 years at community college after I left the superintendency, and I oversaw a thing called the Central Ohio Compact in Columbus, Ohio, which was a regional partnership involving higher ed, K-12, employers, and increasingly the human services sector. Because that is the power. We had a dashboard tracking progress. We do a lot of those things. Those are the kind of local regional efforts that get down to context of regions. Because Ohio is a very diverse state in terms of just the diversity of our population and the employment opportunities in various parts of our state. So they need to be localized decisions there. So the power of these intermediary organizations to help get kids on a path to where they want to be is, I think, a really important part. Employers don't want 611 districts knocking at their door for internships or apprenticeships. They need some way to organize all that, and I think some of these intermediaries can do that.
Thank you.
Great idea.
The amazing Don Shalvey, who I know was a friend to so many in this room, used to say that he wanted to make sure, right, exactly, that students were able to do what they love and earn what they need. And you all are doing important leadership work to make that happen. We want to thank you for what you all do, and I would ask you to join me in thanking these folks, and we're glad to have had this conversation.